When you install the Rimcities mod, you are given access to a gigantic urban expanse, with hundreds of tightly packed buildings, busy streets and a huge population. These city maps are pretty good if you want to reenact all the best bits of Independence Day. While it truly fills my heart with joy to see an entire city destroyed by 5,000 anti-grain warheads, if we were to build an invincible wall that totally surrounded their city, would the inhabitants of an imprisoned city go completely mad? Or would they rely on their vast stores of supplies so that they might outlast our clever siege? When we last tried this experiment on a regular settlement, we came to the conclusion that the inhabitants will just go completely insane as soon as they're unable to leave their base. Once they started attacking the walls, the enemy pawns lost all of their self-preservation instincts, and by refusing to eat, the enemy ultimately defeated themselves. But after invading and destroying about 10 cities, I've noticed that the pawns on city maps seem to behave very differently to pawns found on regular settlements. They almost seem to act in a similar way to your own colonists, as opposed to just acting as glorified raiders or guards. The only practical way to find out just what they'll do if we imprison their entire city is to imprison their entire city, and to guarantee that the enemy has absolutely no chance of escape, we will be building our walls from a material called pico machinery. Having 300,000 hit points, these walls are almost indestructible. If we're going to stand any chance of building our walls around an entire enemy city, then it's going to take a massive invasion force and all the resources of a rich Glitterworld colony to get the job done. I assembled a strike force of over 80 slave soldiers, backed up by over a dozen cataphract armored colonists. I was a little bit concerned that assaulting a city with 90 heavily armed commandos might kill the entire population of the city before we could imprison them. So instead of engaging in my usual methods of warfare, which usually involve lots of big guns and explosions, in order to preserve our enemies now so we can torture them later, I've decided to arm our entire invasion force with non-lethal weapons. With each of our expendable slave soldiers armed with these tasers, they should be able to put the enemy down without putting them down for good. And each one of our cataphract armored commandos will be armed with these interesting looking dart guns. It looks like they fire tranquilizer darts. I've gotta wonder what that's gonna do against power armor. I decided to leave a single colonist behind so that the launch base wouldn't be completely unguarded. While we're on the subject of weapons, you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the 600 transport pods behind our guys. While these transport pods are each loaded with a single anti-grain warhead, I've set up this weapon system so we might clear some space for our wall amongst the city. While we could construct our walls around the buildings, personally I think it would be more in fitting with the general theme of this channel if we just blew up the buildings instead. With our strike force looking eager to drop, I ordered the troops to enter their transport pods, and as the multitudes of slave soldiers packed into their pods, I thought it was a good time as any to bring up the fact that the Fallen Empire aren't even really our enemy. So as soon as we drop our 90-strong invasion force on top of the city of Takape, the defenders of the city will initially not attack us, as they basically consider us friends. And as our invasion force was thrust into the sky, the city of Takape's days of happiness and prosperity were at an end. Our slave soldiers dropped in the first wave, landing directly on top of enemy defensive positions. The clueless defenders seemed completely oblivious to the fact that 100 soldiers had just dropped into their home. As the first of our soldiers reached their rally points, they began to explore further into the city. As they crossed streets and open spaces, our slave soldiers began to enter the enemy buildings. Our slave soldiers' first mission objective is to enter every building in the city so that it is possible to see what's actually going on inside. After all, there wouldn't be much fun in running a prison like this if we can't see our prisoners shivving each other to death. As soon as our slave soldiers had completed their first objective, we were ready to begin the tactical demolition of the outskirts of their city. But instead of dropping the pods straight in, I decided to set down some plans so that I could be a bit more accurate when it comes time to aiming these pods. I want to build our perimeter wall at the very limits of buildable space on the map. As I started aiming the pods at the enemy city, I simply followed the lines that I had laid down so that our artillery shells would fall in a predictable pattern. Once all of the shells are detonated, this should create a wide no man's land around the edge of the city, which should give this city a more prison-like appearance. And as we unleashed a storm of 600 transport pods, the city of Takape was looking particularly doomed. The transport pods came crashing through the roofs of every building on the outskirts of the city, and as soon as all of our transport pods had made groundfall, they disgorged their payload of 600 anti-grain warheads, and as every roadway, pavement and building was totally inundated with high explosive death, the outskirts of the city was beginning to resemble a badly organized ammunition dump. At the center of the city, our slaves were heading north towards their second rally point. Seeing as we have about 5 times as many slaves as we do colonists, to help prevent any annoying slave rebellions, I sent about 40 of my slaves to guard the anti-grain warheads, if you catch my drift. With the outskirts of the city rigged to blow, it was time to send in the second wave of our invasion. I dropped in half a dozen colonists, along with a single transport pod containing a bunch of rocket launchers. As soon as our team had made groundfall, they equipped themselves with some heavy ordnance. As our slaves were performing their vital guard duties, one of our slave soldiers seemed to go completely mad, and he started beating one of his comrades half to death. And despite trying their very best to look as inconspicuous as possible, one of the locals eyeballed our strike team along with all the rocket launchers they were carrying. While one full half of our slaves will be sacrificed in the coming detonation, the other half were ordered to hold up in this small building so that they might have some cover when the defenders of the city figure out what we're up to. And as the citizens of the fallen empire seemed totally oblivious to our plans, I ordered the strike team to light this sucker up. As 5 missiles struck their targets, the missiles exploded, setting off a chain of 600 anti-grain detonations. With warheads exploding left, right and center, the enemy's buildings began to disappear into the blinding flash, and as the explosion headed north, it totally rolled over a large building and then proceeded to wipe out some small hills, forever changing the landscape with sheer explosive force. As the explosion rolled into the northwestern corner, the explosion actually turned the corner, and as the north side of the map began to detonate, the 40 unwanted slaves were completely annihilated. With 40 less pawns on the map, we should get a better frame rate as soon as the detonations are done. And as the 40 surviving slaves took cover in an enemy building, our explosion continued to roll past them to the north. A random Empire guy fired a missile launcher into the explosion. It's hard to identify just what he was trying to achieve with this. As our explosion glanced the buildings that held our slaves, it began to turn another corner and head south. When you look at our explosion from really high up, it kind of resembles a trail of burning gunpowder. As the anti-grain detonations wiped out yet another building, entire streets were absorbed into the raging glow. Anybody who found themselves in the path of our detonations stood absolutely no chance of survival whatsoever. And as the explosion began to roll into the southeastern corner, it devastated a few small mountains and wiped out a small crowd of Empire citizens. This particular power-armored badass seemed to be pretty nonchalant in the face of such a gigantic blast. And as another large block of buildings fell to our glorious chain of detonations, it looked like our strategic detonations were nearly complete. Unfortunately for our strike team, a raiding party of Empire soldiers was headed their way, and as the anti-grains brought down the last of the enemy structures on the outskirts of the city, I was quite relieved to see that the strike team were still in one piece. As the smoke cleared, It looked like we had destroyed about 50% of all the buildings in the city. But with a few dozen Empire soldiers closing in on their position, our strike team had no choice but to head north. After nearly running into the very Empire soldiers they were trying to evade, our strike team demonstrated their bionic prowess as they headed through the city towards where the slaves were positioned. A number of Empire soldiers had managed to surround the building, trapping our slaves inside, but they seemed to be having a hard time dealing with our overwhelming numbers. The slower members of the strike team had to try their best to keep up with Pickle, who clearly had the best bionics of the lot. But as Pickle was waiting for the rest to catch up, the enemy began to swarm the strike squad. Our guys quickly broke out of the ambush, and then they headed straight over some difficult ground, which would slow them down just enough to give that uranium slug turret a chance of getting in some hits. Despite taking several grazes from that uranium slug turret, our strike team managed to rendezvous with the slaves without taking a single casualty. As the strike team took cover in the building, several Empire soldiers followed them inside. With the doors wide open, the enemy can pour fire inside of the structure, which could make this a difficult fight for our slave soldiers. With the situation looking like it couldn't get much worse, it quickly proceeded to get much worse as that Empire raiding party finally caught up to our forces. They quickly began to storm all three entrances to the building, totally surrounding our guys as they attempted to force more of their men inside of the building. As the slaves only had access to taser guns to defend themselves, it looked like the slaves were going to take some heavy casualties. With the enemy tied up in a totally pointless battle, this would give our second strike team a bit of breathing room. After resupplying the slaves with some shock batons, the second strike team landed in the northwest corner of the map, where they immediately came under fire from an enemy mini-turret. As a transport pod filled to the brim with pico machinery landed next to the strike squad, Salazar wasted no time charging the enemy mini-turret, which proceeded to explode after only a few hits from the Zeus hammer. With a ton of pico machinery at our disposal, I decided to start setting down the first of the wall blueprints. I started with the northwest corner as it was fairly quiet here, as just about every Empire soldier in the city was tied up fighting our slaves in the northeast. And while it looked like our slaves were in desperate need of some backup, instead of sending the second strike team to help them out, I extended our walls out a bit further as the second strike team began constructing the wall itself. While the tasers had been fairly ineffectual against the Empire troops, once my slaves had been re-equipped with shock batons, they started to fight back against the Empire's assault a lot more effectively, and as they clobbered their way out of the building, they managed to make their way to the north side of the building, where they outflanked some heavily armed Empire troops, providing a bit of breathing room to the slaves trapped within. Despite displaying a middling commitment to the task at hand, the second strike team was slowly but surely building our wall, so I extended the blueprints all the way to the south side of the map, and once I was done extending the blueprints to the west of the map, this accounted for about one half of the wall's blueprints. As our slaves finally had some success in fighting the Empire, a random local wandered into the building, where they proceeded to pick up a plate of food and wander off with it. While the fallen Empire was hell-bent on pushing us from their city, there were plenty of locals from unaffiliated factions who barely seemed to react to the massive battle taking place right next to them. With the first strike team and the slaves working together, they eventually managed to overpower all of the Empire soldiers in the building. Just as the second strike squad was making some decent progress on the wall, a single Empire soldier rudely interrupted the second strike team's building operations. Seeing as our slaves had fought so hard alongside our first strike team, I decided to reward their fighting prowess by providing them with a sort of makeshift field hospital. Normally when my slaves are downed in battle, I just leave them to bleed to death on the floor. as it seems a just punishment to the slave for getting injured in the first place. So while these slaves might very well complain that they'll be treated in a bombed out building, they should in fact consider themselves very privileged to be treated at all. As soon as our men started to drag away the injured slaves and colonists, they immediately came under fire from that annoying uranium slug turret, and as our guys were doing their best not to get hit while they dragged away the wounded, a single drop pod came through the ceiling, containing enough industrial medicine to get everybody back on their feet. That uranium slug turret was becoming a real hassle, with our guys having to dodge armor-piercing rounds every time they tried to extract the wounded. I sent in a colonist called Nails. Between the overshield, the power armor and the warhammer, that uranium slug turret didn't stand a chance against Nails, and as soon as Pickle joined the fray with her shock baton, that turret was reduced to nothing but twisted metal and failure. And as Pickle and Nails made their way back towards the field hospital, a random local seemed to be giving our guys some grief. When you go to the lengths of using non-lethal weaponry against your enemies, I have to say it's pretty disappointing when you see the enemy die anyway. Despite taking hits from the taser and the shock baton, this pig just didn't want to go down. With the fallen Empire's troops seemingly losing interest in fighting us, it looked like we would have some time to heal our wounded and get everybody ready to build the wall. But just as I was trying to enjoy a moment of peace, the fallen Empire sent yet another raiding party to help relieve the beleaguered defenders of the city. With their transport pods going haywire, the Empire soldiers would be attacking us piecemeal. So I gathered all of our colonists and slaves still on their feet, so we could concentrate our numbers on the southern entrance to the field hospital. While our forces repelled the first invaders with ease, there were plenty more Imperial soldiers bearing down on our location. Some infiltrators had snuck their way in through the north side of the field hospital, but as the Imperials fell to our defenders, Salazar went totally berserk. It looks like her rampage was triggered by malnutrition. I really don't think anyone's eaten anything since they got here. I sent in some backup to help deal with Salazar, but due to her being equipped with cataphract armor and a Zeus hammer, she proved to be a difficult opponent to put down, even when she was outnumbered 5-1. Just as things looked like they couldn't get any worse, Herdina experienced a mental break, seemingly going berserk from a lack of recreational activities. That's no excuse for attacking your fellow colonists. Seeing as we were starting to take casualties, I ordered my guys to retreat to the north end of the field hospital. As the colonists took cover, a maddened Gumpy charged towards Bell, only to succumb to the tranquilizers the moment he came within lunging distance. I sent a few of these colonists back to help deal with Salazar, but before they could get there, Nails was yet another one of our colonists to go completely mad. Just as Salazar finally succumbed to her multiple injuries, Nails was knocked unconscious after a brief clobbering by some stun batons. I sent our fastest colonists to outflank the Imperial soldiers who were still holed up in the north side of the building. Once we had defeated the last of the attackers, it looked like there were no more enemies in the immediate vicinity, as it looked like the Imperial defenders had congregated at the heart of the still intact city. While the enemy AI might be smart enough to feed themselves and sleep in regular locations, they're still not clever enough to refuel their own generators. So to save us from having to work in the dark, I decided to install a number of torch lamps around the field hospital. I potted in some logs as there were no trees left in this location. As soon as the lumber had arrived, I set one of my colonists straight to constructing one of the torch lamps. But as soon as we managed to get the first torch lamp complete, it seems that one of the locals was rather upset with our presence here. Ever since our forces made groundfall, it seems that a whole minute could not go by where we didn't find ourselves constantly having to fight off the angry Imperials. After outflanking them, the interloper was quickly put down. While there were plenty of our own downed soldiers in need of rescue, our best doctors needed to prioritize treating our colonists, before the wounds sustained from the previous night's combat could become life-threatening. While Nails was one of our best close combat fighters, I had basically forgotten about him being downed. With insufficient time to save him, we simply left him on the floor to die. With so many colonists and slaves demanding medical attention, I decided that I was finally bored of playing doctor, so I sent in a few more pods of pico machinery so our guys might actually get around to doing the important stuff like building that wall. Back at the field hospital, Hardgrave had gone completely berserk over an unburied colonist. But as Stumpy one-hitted Hardgrave with a tactical slap to the face, Hardgrave's rampage was brought to a satisfying conclusion. Considering how many times we've already been assaulted by the Empire's raiding parties, I decided to extend our invincible wall so that it might form an invincible curtain wall to better surround the field hospital. Once I had connected the blueprints up with the rest of our wall sections, I sent in a few extra pods of pico machinery so our guys could get the job done. And while the colonists at the field hospital started to construct the walls, Pickle and Omi's attempts to work on the eastern stretch of wall was being rudely interrupted by an Empire soldier armed with some sort of SMG. While the tasers and dart guns weren't really that effective against enemies who actually had proper guns, once the enemy finds themselves on the receiving end of a couple of stun batons, it doesn't really matter how heavily armed they are, the fight is usually over in a matter of seconds. Just as it looked like Pickle and Omi were about to down this interloper, another raiding party was on its way from the Empire's allies. By the looks of things, the pigs from the Bot Pact had dropped onto our launch base, and as they began to charge towards the undefended facility, it looked like they would have total free reign to plunder the riches of our home base. This could make it very difficult for us to resupply our forces in the field. Despite being the only colonist present to defend the launch base, there was no way that Crom was going to let those pigs steal our stuff. If he could manage to reach the heavy ordnance in time, he might be able to stop the invaders dead in their tracks. I sent in the last wave of supply pods, dropping in some much needed supplies on top of the field hospital. Once again, our guys were under attack. It looked like a few Empire soldiers that had previously been downed had gotten back up. Just as the Imperials were pouring fire into our hospital, Cab suddenly lost all faith in our glorious mission. I drafted some of our wounded colonists and had them re-equipped. I then sent them to the north end of the field hospital along with the rest of our colonists so we could swarm over the Empire soldiers that were pouring machine gun fire into our hospital. I had my colonists beat the last of the Empire invaders to death. As we currently had no jail cells to hold them, they were just going to keep getting back up and causing more of a nuisance. And as our bionic commandos pulled the last of the Empire survivors limb from limb, it suddenly dawned on me that Cab's complaints might not have been totally unfounded. After all, the field hospital was flooded with over 80 corpses. Back at the launch base, Crom was in a race against the mutant invaders, as he tried his best to cut them off before they could reach our supplies. I ejected some Doomsday rocket launchers as I launched the last of the anti-grain pods directly onto our own location. The pigs of the Bot Pact seemed a lot more interested in stealing our ammunition than actually attacking the base. This gave Crom the chance to set up a decent firing position, and with a single shot from his Doomsday rocket launcher, the ammunition our enemies tried to steal detonated in their hands, which served them right for trying to steal from us in the first place. Crom gave our fleeing opponents little opportunity to escape, disemboweling the pig that was closest to the edge of the map before moving in on the final survivor and slaughtering them in just a couple of hits. If you're wondering why Crom is totally unstoppable in close combat, well, it's probably got something to do with the Architect Deathclaw he's got grafted onto his arm. I knew these things were powerful, but I had no idea that they allowed you to attack about twice as fast. While Crom got busy constructing and filling some transport pods, back at the base I was pleasantly surprised to see that our forces were not currently under attack. Bell and Stumpy had even snuck out of our base, so that they could go and play some poker in the enemy city. The enemy citizens seemed for the most part just to be getting on with their lives, but if we were ever going to imprison them, then we were going to need to get that wall built. Seeing as Crom had already managed to load all of the other transport pods, I decided to send him forward, as he was the only colonist I still had left who wasn't perforated with bullet holes. As Crom's drop pod landed to the north of the field hospital, he immediately came under fire from a stray Imperial soldier. But after just a little bit of disemboweling, the field hospital was once again secured. While our colonists had tried their best to get the wall built, Crom proceeded to immediately put all of their efforts to shame. He had only been here 2 minutes, and yet the curtain walls were already coming together nicely. Just as it looked like we were finally getting something built, a random local decided to wander onto our territory. But as all of the colonists and slaves rallied together, it looked like the local was only grabbing a bite to eat. Just as he was about to head back into the city, he decided to charge towards our forces. And with the dart guns proving to be ineffective, our colonists were left with no choice but to beat this random local to death. The commotion seemed to have attracted the attention of another Imperial soldier, but seeing as they were better armed than the last one, I sent in Crom to sort them out. In a burst of gunfire that seemed to come from nowhere, Jam took a hit to the chest that killed them outright. But as soon as Crom was done dealing retribution, I wasted no time in undrafting the rest of our guys so that we could finally get some building done on these curtain walls. While Crom continued to put everybody else's building skills to shame, it was good to finally have a moment where everybody could just work on the base. While there weren't many Imperial soldiers left over in the city proper, they seemed to have no problem finding people to throw at our defenses. As our guys tried to put some distance between themselves and the heavily armoured close combat specialist headed their way, once again the dart guns proved to be almost useless. Hardgrave was caught off guard and downed as he tried to flee, and as Veronica closed in on the rest of our colonists, they pummeled her to the ground before Crom could close the distance and sort out this mess himself. As soon as Hardgrave was dragged away to the field hospital, I undrafted the rest of my guys, but I decided it was best that Crom finish off Veronica just in case she gets back up to cause more havoc. With the curtain walls surrounding the field hospital nearing completion, soon we could get back to building the walls to encircle the city. But for the meantime, I decided to give all our guys with low construction skills the ever glamorous job of pulling all of the corpses out of the field hospital before they could stink up the place. I decided to install some doors in our wall so our guys wouldn't get completely trapped inside. I noticed that one of the Imperial soldiers was paying far too much attention to one of our stray colonists. As Stumpy was wandering about in sadness, he sadly wandered into enemy territory. Despite telling Stumpy to defend himself, he was having none of it. And as the Imperial soldier opened fire with his minigun, I sent in all of my colonists to lend Stumpy a hand, with the rest of my colonists getting into position to ambush the Imperial soldier. I placed Crom and his overshield directly in front of the Imperial soldier. As the soldier fired upon Crom, his accuracy became totally laughable, with any stray shots managing to hit Crom fizzling off harmlessly in his overshield. After taking one too many hits from the dart guns, Andrew eventually collapsed from the sheer amount of sedatives in his system. I find it odd how some enemies are almost immediately incapacitated by the dart guns, while others seem to require dozens of hits before they will eventually be downed. Despite bringing nothing but non-lethal weapons, it looks like our invasion has already managed to murder the vast majority of the city. So to save Andrew from being stacked on the corpse heap, I decided to strip him of his armor. Because of this, we shouldn't have to resort to killing him if he wakes up again. Just as our colonists were removing the last of the corpses from the field hospital, I realized that the curtain walls were finally complete, with the field hospital finally having some sort of protection against Imperial raiders. I decided that it was finally time to extend the wall to the southeast corner of the city, where I encountered one of the only surviving hills on the map, as well as this annoying body of water. I decided to just build over the entire area, stretching our wall blueprints all the way to the southwest corner of the map. And as our colonists were slowly but surely constructing the outer wall, I decided to repair the damage to the walls in the field hospital, as I'm pretty sure my colonists would prefer to have their bullet wounds sorted while they're indoors, not outdoors. While there weren't really that many of the Imperial defenders left alive, those who had managed to survive so far seemed to be in pretty good health. Despite the fact that the power was out, half the city was destroyed and most of the population had already been killed, the locals seemed to be sleeping in regular spots and eating regular meals. So as long as our forces kept away from the defenders, we should soon be able to imprison the last of the Imperial defenders alive in the city. While our colonists had tried their best to get the wall constructed, a complete lack of beds in the field hospital was making it difficult for them to complete their task. And as our colonists were napping on the job on the west side of the city, Sam began to instigate a slave rebellion. As the rebels began to make their way from the west, I gathered everybody still loyal to the cause, so we could deal with this slave insurrection with brutal efficiency. Our forces headed into the courtyard at the entrance to the city. As they took up firing positions, it looked like Sam and his rebels had managed to catch the attention of some Imperial soldiers. As Sam approached our colonists, he began to implore the rest of our slaves to join his pathetic rebellion. Crom wasted no time pummeling Sam to the ground for his terrible disloyalty, but with our guys surrounded by hostile slaves and Imperial soldiers beginning to open fire, the slaves seemed a bit distracted with fighting the Empire. It seems that when everybody brings a tranquilizer gun to a gunfight, nobody wins. So instead of continuing this awkward gunfight, I just sent in Crom so he could quickly put Yorkie back in his place by disemboweling him. With the Grand Slave Revolt put down, and only a few of our colonists in need of medical attention, I saw absolutely no reason to rescue those traitorous slaves. If they managed to walk back to the field hospital under their own strength, then I would offer them medical care and keep them on as a slave. But any rebel that failed to make it back to home base would simply be left out in the enemy city to die. For the first time since our colonists had dropped in on the city, it looked like they were finally having a decent night's sleep. As the rest of the night rolled by without incident, the following dawn was broken by assault rifle fire, as yet another Imperial soldier decided to attack our forces single-handedly. After taking several hits from Bell and Stumpy's dart guns, the sedatives began to take effect. But just as I thought the fighting was over, it looked like Crom had started a fight with a random Imperial. I ordered everyone to return to base, just in case the enemy brought more numbers to bear. It looks like the Imperials have befriended some insectoids. As they began to charge our firing position, the insects seemed to back off, but the guy in the power armor just kept on coming at us. As the tranquilizer darts plinked harmlessly from his armor, he began to lob his frag grenades at our guys. Seeing as we were determined to keep him alive, I was forced to engage in this deadly grenade dance, constantly reshuffling my colonists in the hope that they might avoid getting blown to pieces. I sent in Crom as a distraction because he's basically indestructible. It started to look like the sedatives were having an effect on the Imperial Grenadier, but due to a split-second distraction, a single grenade made it through, killing Cab despite his armor in one hit. Despite the best efforts of our forces to keep this Imperial soldier alive, he eventually just died on us anyway, but not before attempting a death from the grave against Stumpy. Just as soon as the Grenadier boss fight was over, I sent my guys back to the field hospital to tend to their grenade-related wounds. I still have no idea why some enemies just don't seem to want to be downed by dart guns. I continue to strip the power armor from downed opponents, as this will make managing the general population a lot easier in the event of a future conflict with our colonists. Even though I've restricted the movement of our colonists to the home area immediately around our wall, that still didn't do much to stop random Empire soldiers walking up and attacking us. It was almost as if they didn't want their entire city to be imprisoned. Due to witnessing untold levels of violence and slaughter, Fugly had given up on our glorious mission. Fugly had gone wild, but with her being one of our most bionic colonists, we were definitely going to have to try to reclaim her in a future episode. With the gap in the southern wall shrinking with each passing minute, a few inmates attempted a daring last-minute escape. But as Harry charged towards the edge of the map, they turned around and threw away any chance of escape. Even though the prisoners seemed pretty adept at foiling their own escape plans, I decided to send a lot of backup to help them out a bit. Once everyone had arrived on the scene, Zippy was already experiencing the effects of tranquilizer darts, and as Harry maneuvered around our colonists to attack them from the north, he opted to try and punch all of our colonists to death, despite the fact that he was carrying a charge lance. With decision-making skills like that, it's not surprising that he's about to go to prison. I turned a nearby building into a makeshift prison cell. Zippy and Harry were losing quite a bit of blood after their failed escape attempt. As our colonists got back to installing the last wall section, it looked like Crom was going to be the one to put the last wall section in, but at the last second, Gumpy managed to beat him to it. With our invincible prison walls finally completed, I ordered all of my guys back to base, as I didn't want to accidentally imprison any of our own guys. And as Crom blocked off the last route in or out of the city, the Imperial city of Takape could finally be reclassified as a prison. As soon as we had finished constructing our prison walls, the inmates began to express their dissatisfaction with their confinement, mostly by harmlessly charging into our invincible walls. But as they kicked and punched at the invincible pico-machinery barriers, I had to wonder if we would see a repeat of the results from the last experiment. Although a lot of the inmates were attacking our walls, it looked like a few of their number were still behaving normally. And by the time night rolled in, every hostile inmate returned to their homes, where they proceeded to get a good night's sleep, like normal colonists. As the dawn broke, we were greeted with the sight of a docile general population. While this has been one of the most difficult builds I've ever had to do in Rimworld, being able to steal an entire working city from the fallen empire makes this totally worth it. For all their pomposity and self-importance, it seems a fitting punishment for the citizens of Takape to wander the streets of their demolished city wearing nothing but rags as they desperately search for the next mouthful of sustenance. Even though we have managed to wall in an entire city, if we want to continue to observe our inmates and their day-to-day struggles, then we will need to develop our base in the northeast corner of the city so that it can better support a large occupying force. But seeing as this video is already nearly 40 minutes long, I think I'm going to turn the imprisonment of Takape into its own little series. That way we can much more effectively document the suffering of our inmates. And while the fallen empire might find the imprisonment of Takape somewhat insulting, if we really want to piss off these Imperials, then we're going to have to start kidnapping their colonists from their other settlements so we can pod them directly into our prison. I have no idea what the enemy pawns would do in that situation. Would they just join in with the rest of the inmates and just live in the city? Or would they just go completely nuts and try to bash their way through the walls with their face? This is just one of the crazy experiments I've got lined up for our prison in the future. So if you'd like to see what would happen when I run a prison with absolutely no moral scruples, then please subscribe, as we will be releasing plenty of content just like this in the near future. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to disembowel that like button with an Archotech Deathclaw. And while you're at it, don't forget to leave us a comment down below, as I try to reply to each comment in a fairly timely manner.